Meeting will start shortly.
Order, and welcome to this session of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee, where we're continuing our inquiry into fairness in the food supply chain. We're having two witness sessions this afternoon, and I'll start off with the usual stricture in which we can try and keep the questions pointed and as brief as possible, and the answers as well. And if you agree with what one of your colleagues has said, then don't be frightened to just say I agree rather than necessarily repeat that. So could we start by asking our witnesses to introduce themselves and describe their role, starting with Peter.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter Dawson. I'm the Policy and Sustainability Director of Dairy UK, which is the trade association representing dairy processors in the United Kingdom. And my responsibilities cover primarily economic and commercial issues affecting our members.
Thank you, Peter. Robert?
I'm Robert Sheasby, the Chief Executive of the Agricultural Industries Confederation, a membership organisation with over 230 members across the UK, representing interests in animal feed, arable marketing, crop protection and agronomy, fertiliser and seed.
Is this mainly things that farmers buy in rather than things farmers sell?
Typically the inputs that farmers require, but also the marketing of seeds and grains, pulses, post-farm gate.
Okay, thank you. And Rod?
So I'm Rod Addy. I'm Director General of the Provision Trade Federation. We operate in 3 food sector areas, dairy, pork and fish. We support our members through trade. We act as a lobbying group, a voice between them and government. And we have just over 100 members, mainly based in the UK, but some overseas.
Okay, thank you. I suppose the background to this inquiry is the massive food price inflation that we've seen since the invasion of Ukraine. Possibly we saw food inflation of 24.8% over the 2 years to January, which, to put it into perspective, is equivalent to the food inflation for the previous 13 years. I think particularly talking to farmers in the dairy sector, we'll probably start with you, Peter, they're the ones that seem to be most exposed to price fluctuations and in many cases complaining they can't make a decent income. So how would you say manufacturers and processors have altered their practices as a result of the recent high rates of food price inflation in recent years, Peter?
Well, perhaps just looking first at in terms of the products offered to consumers, I think there may have been some change in product mix because consumers are obviously more focused on value during high food price inflation, and there may have been some simplification of product lines, but I would imagine that hopefully now consumer confidence has picked up a bit, that we still are able to revert back to the full spectrum of product offering we had before. And in respect of supply chain relationships with farmers, the fundamentals remain unchanged. Unfortunately, the dairy industry now is exposed to a global pricing dynamic. It is the global supply-demand balance for raw milk as manifested in the commodity markets, which drives raw milk prices. It provides the underlying trend. And that's true with all industries exposed to the world market, which includes ourselves.
Would that apply? I mean, I can see that applying to cheese and butter and commodities that are internationally traded, but things like liquid milk and some of the more perishable dairy products, is it also as susceptible to what's happening globally?
To a degree, yes. There is a segment of the UK dairy industry which is, to a degree, isolated from these trends, and this is those dairy farmers under aligned supply chain arrangements with their retailers. Essentially, it's the retailers and those arrangements that determine the price paid to farmers. And for many retailers, that actually is based on cost of production. But those arrangements only cover about 20% of milk volume in the UK. The rest of milk supply is subject to this global pricing dynamic, which does ultimately embrace the liquid milk market as well, because if market prices are rising, the returns from liquid milk also have to be competitive. So that is the mechanism by which liquid milk is ultimately linked back to commodity markets.
Thank you. Robert, you're supplying farmers a lot, and farmers are facing pressures from sort of above, and are you sort of meeting the sandwich in some ways in terms of the pressures put on you from farmers?
Yeah, as Peter's touched on there, a lot of products are in a global marketplace. So products are moved around the world, inputs, feed materials, sources of feed materials, source of ag chem products. So whatever the global market is, tends to be, if the UK wants to pay that price, the product is available for UK consumption. If the UK doesn't wish to pay that price, then it will move to a different marketplace, and that would apply across animal feed, crop protection and agronomy products, fertiliser and seed.
Understood. And Rod, how's the sectors you represent, how has the sort of the way that inflation's unfolded affect you, and particularly in fish, because we eat a lot of imported fish, and following the problems buying fish from Russia, which we all agree with. I mean, you must have particular problems in that sector, have you?
Yes, I mean, it has been a real challenge, and I think it does highlight, again, that kind of the global volatility that we are currently facing in the food supply chain. And that volatility is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, much as we might wish it to, I think just purely on the basis of the impact of climate change, for example, that is going to continue to ripple on through the chain for probably much over a decade, I would say. You're looking at decades plural. So I think I would argue that we need perhaps a different paradigm way of looking at food and food production.
Yeah. I think when inflation hits, prices go up very quickly, but we've seen recent falls in the price of wheat, price of oilseeds, quite a lot of commodities, milk prices have eased off. It's a little bit like at the petrol pumps. They put the price up straight away, but then when the price of crude oil falls, it seems to take a long time to feed through. I mean, is that a fair criticism of the people you represent, Peter?
No, I don't think it is. I think our members, the dairy processors, are feeling the impact of food price deflation quite severely. Their prices came under immediate pressures once the commodity market started to fall back. And certainly the cheese sector has suffered quite badly because they're purchasing raw milk at a high price and then selling the resulting product, which had been matured, onto a declining market. In terms of the impact on the consumer, that obviously is very much at the discretion of the retailers. And obviously I can't speak on their behalf as to what pricing policy they would adopt.
So could we see prices falling in the supermarkets? We talked about inflation, easing back to 4% and possibly in some commodities prices not increasing at all. But I mean, is it something that isn't within the psyche of the retail sector to actually sort of cut price? They just take advantage of the falling input prices, the falling prices of the products they're putting on the shelves and increase their profits.
Well, I would have presumed if there's a sufficient degree of competition between them, then ultimately any fall in the wholesale prices that they are charged would percolate through to the consumer. But that obviously depends on the competitive dynamic between them. And I'm not really privy to what pricing strategies they've elected for their own individual businesses, I'm afraid.
Robert, do you agree with that?
I think Peter's right. When it comes to input prices, yes, when they go up, they are usually passed through the supply chain, but it's a very competitive marketplace for agricultural inputs. They are, as I touched on earlier, traded globally, and when prices fall, the input prices fall, and we've seen that across all, I think, farm inputs in the last year. They've come back from the highs of where we were in 2020, maybe 18 months ago, 2022, and moved substantially. Probably the most notable one would be a couple of years ago, we were talking about ammonium nitrate being at £900 a tonne. It's now back to somewhere around 350, and you could apply that to grains that were at 400 and now trading nearer 160, 170. Pounds per tonne, that is, Chair.
Yeah. But bread hasn't come down.
Well, I'm not responsible for bread, I'm afraid, Chair. You might want to ask that question to somebody else giving evidence, but it wouldn't be for me to make an observation about what's happening there, other than perhaps energy price, which has moved, but that's for someone else.
I think Peter used the word percolate down. So the impression people get is that when prices rise, then they rise quickly on the shelves and everywhere. And when prices of inputs fall, they percolate down slowly. I mean, is that a characterisation that you would recognise? You did use the word percolate, Peter.
I think I would sympathise with that impression, but I can't say authoritatively whether that is the case. I would have thought statistics perhaps from collected by the government on retail prices would be the best indication of what's actually going on. and the best body that would be enabled to give a real insight into this would be the CMA. They have been looking into various sectors. They didn't find that there was a problem with liquid milk. They came to the conclusion that it was a low margin sector, but they've only highlighted, I understand, infant formula as one worthy of further investigation.
Right.
So that's the only information I can provide, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Anything to add, Rod, at this stage?
I guess I would approach this slightly differently. I mean, I over the years, I've kind of experienced a lot of the kind of oppositional language of retailers versus suppliers. I think we have to move away from that. I think it's vital we move away from that, because if we don't, then a lot of the problems will continue to persist. And I mean, yes, retailers have to make a margin when you look at the turnover they produce. That margin seems like quite a lot, but you have to also balance that up against the fact that they are extremely large businesses and they need to reinvest. So that profit isn't going in nowhere. It's actually going back into the business. The question is, could some of that profit be redistributed in the supply chain? Potentially, yes. So there's something to look at there. But while you get bogged down in, you're just fat cats making profit arguments, then I think you're never going to move past that to a point where you have a serious discussion about those sort of things.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to add something?
Chair, I wanted to add, if I may, that in the supply industry, people use written contracts, and those written contracts are written into the future. So when prices are moving up, people are taking positions that cover them for a period into the future. So you talk about how quickly prices might come down. Sometimes, and I can't say for all, but I've got a copy of an AIC contract here, there's an example. Those prices are written in, so there are pre-agreed contracts in place, which those contracts have got to unwind through the marketing period. And people will take positions, if I was thinking about the feed sector, they may well take animal feed in particular, I'm talking about here, Chair, where they may take a position every month on what their requirements over the coming 12 months will be. So they are hedging against volatility in the marketplace. And those contracts build up and those contracts unwind over time. And that might be why, if you're looking at the spot price and then looking at what's happening more widely, you're not seeing a direct correlation, because you're not able to see where those contract prices are factored in, because they're private between the parties, the contracting parties.
Yeah, I think that's what we saw with eggs when the price of chicken feed went through the roof, that some people were cushioned by their contracts, but others were finding they were losing a load of money, and the supermarkets held them to their contracts and then wondered why there were no eggs in the autumn. I mean, is that one of the problems with some of these contracts, that they don't allow this sort of flexibility? Rod, did you want to add to that?
I mean, I think you need a balance in fixed price contracts. So, a fixed price contract is a two-edged sword. If you fix, a bit like a mortgage, if you fix when the rate's low, then your quid's in until the end of that term. But if you fix when the rate is relatively high, and then that rate goes down, you're held to quite a high level of damage, and that works both ways. I think what you need is a system where you have perhaps a longer term contract to guarantee that relationship, but that contract is perhaps a little bit more variable, going back to the mortgage analogy, where it's able to respond more flexibly to inflationary pressures up or down, so that's kind of built into the system. It's more flexibility, I would argue, is...
And our supermarkets looking at longer and longer contracts. We heard from Ali Kappa in an early evidence session talking about apples, where they were now expecting the growers to sign the contract before the fruit had even blossomed, never mind it had formed on the trees.
Yes, so and that's where I think you need the balance. You need a longer guarantee, but you also need flexibility, and you need an understanding and recognition that the supply chain takes a long time, as you rightly say, with the whole growing of an apple crop once planted to come to fruition, a 7-year period. I mean, with livestock, it's not something you can turn around overnight. The investment and all the general kind of running costs of farms need to be factored into the equation. But above and beyond all of this, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, we need a coordinated UK-wide food policy that will kind of pull all those strands together and recognise all parts of the supply chain equally, really.
The consumer group Which have found that many shoppers are experiencing shrinkflation, where the price of the pack or the size of the pack is reduced, and that usually is used as a way of increasing the unit price. What's driving this trend? Is it driven by inflation or by the need to differentiate products on the shelf? Because some consumers might miss that this pack of butter is 200 grams and that one's 250. I mean, particularly in dairy, that seems to be happening, Peter.
Well, you've got to bear in mind that there's a huge spectrum of products are made available by the dairy industry, and it is not just by UK producers. There's also product coming in from overseas, in Europe primarily. And you also have to bear in mind that a lot of the production for the retail sector is own label, so it is at the specification of the retailers. And in respect of, was it a widespread practice in the dairy industry, I've never seen definitive data on it, but I don't think it was the case for liquid milk, because liquid milk normally comes in very standard uniform packaging sizes, and it's a bit difficult to vary those sizes at relatively short notice. As to the cheese sector, well, it's always been the case that you can vary the portion sizes depending on what is the price point that the retailer wants you to meet. So I think that's always been very much a feature of that market. As for other products, I don't really have much information on it. I mean, whilst it may have helped to cushion the consumers from the full impact of food price inflation, it also helped to actually protect long-term demand, which could have been significantly eroded if the full impact of prices had gone through. So it may reverse itself, I don't know, but we don't really have enough data on it to actually speak as to what was the magnitude of the impact.
Okay. Anything to add on shrinkflation and the change of packing? Is it something that your members consciously look at as a way of keeping their products at the price point or maintaining their profit margins?
I think less so for our members, just because the bulk of them, I'm sure with Peter as well, that operate in the own label sector rather than branded. I think we see it more in branded. I think it's a natural outworking of the huge obsession with keeping prices as low as possible, because it's a kind of way of kind of sneaking out what ostensibly looks like the same product, but actually, is cheaper. I think at times it can border on misleading, but I think I understand why a supply chain would go down that line and retailers would go down that line, because if you're faced with margin being squeezed on all sides and delivering to the consumer, it's a way of delivering a product to the consumer. It might not be exactly the same product, but at the same price point. So you're keeping you're seen to keep the price as low as possible. But I think we have an obsession with low price above all other considerations. I think we need to shift from a view of food that is about cost above all else to a view of food that's about value. The value of food in all its kind of areas. And if you are going to talk about cost as a whole across the supply chain, not just to the end consumer. Fully understand why that is a political hot potato. But I think, ironically, if you do that, then you start to get a handle on cost to the consumer as well.
Understood. Rosie.
Thank you, Chair. We're moving on to talking about the relationship between producers, processors and manufacturers. Who do you all think sets food prices? Anyone can contribute. Yeah, do you want to start?
Well, I mean, if you look up the length of dairy supply chain, I think when it comes to raw milk and the price between the processor and the farmer, that is set by this commodity pricing dynamic that I explained earlier. So that's subject to global forces. But when that is then passed from the processor to the retail prices are very much at the discretion of the retailer. They can decide across the spectrum of their dairy product proposition what products they would want to discount, lead on, encourage, use it as a means of encouraging footfall, and other products in which they want to recover margin. Or alternatively, they might perhaps want to recover discounting on one dairy product in an entirely different sector. So that is very much for them to determine in competition with their own competitors as to how they want to go about it. And in respect of wholesale prices between the processor and the retailer, For commodity products, that is determined by global market trends. But for branded products, that obviously depends on the value that the consumer and therefore the retailer places on that product. So their position in the marketplace varies depending on their own product portfolio. The greater the investment in brands, the stronger their product proposition, and the better able they are to negotiate a price on behalf of their business. And you have to also bear in mind that a significant portion of the British dairy industry is owned by dairy farmers and operated on their behalf. So their ability to negotiate wholesale prices with retailers is also to the direct benefit of dairy farmers. So it's a complex picture, and it's not possible to say point at any given point in time say there's just one single mechanism that is moving it or one party is responsible. It's interaction between three marketplaces over time producing their own lags and their own outcomes.
Thank you, Robert.
Yeah, so with agricultural inputs, I think we are the subject of a global marketplace, and it's our members who are bidding against other countries around the world for that supply of inputs. They're also taking outputs, grains from UK farmers and placing them either into domestic markets or in a year of surplus, placing them into export markets. And that commodities are incredible, by their very nature, are a liquid product. And the world market price will determine what moves where, and that will be influenced by policy. So that could be tariffs that are set by governments around the country, around the world rather. It could be set by weather conditions and the impact that has on productivity in different parts of the world. I'm sure there's a third factor as well, but there are global influences that come into play that will determine prices that people will bid or are prepared to pay in order for a flow of product to take place. And that's just a global competitive marketplace. And I think you need that tension in the global market in order to see flows of trade.
Thank you, Rod.
So there is a global dimension. There's also the local dimension. Price is ultimately, on the one hand, determined by negotiation between the retailer and the direct supplier, and also the direct supplier and obviously their supplier down the chain till you get to the farmers. And obviously, if you have a farming cooperative group, they have more power to be able to kind of push back on those negotiations because they're a larger entity. Same in general terms with brands, because they have more loyalty with shoppers and they command a kind of bigger purchasing base, often than own label. They have correspondingly more power in that negotiatory process. Own label, less so. And obviously, the smaller business you are, the harder you will find those negotiations. But over and above that, there is a kind of structural pressure constantly at work, which is the global supply chain, which is supply and demand internationally from ingredients. And also, I would argue, it hasn't been helped of late by, somebody had to say it first, certain trade deals that we struck initially recently, the UK market, which we're now seeing come back to bite us, where you have the potential for supply to come into the UK from a country that has economies of scale that we don't have. And so therefore, and also not always conforming to all the standards that we have, all of those standards cost. And so therefore, they can undercut domestic suppliers and offer product at a much lower rate. That too will determine price. And again, if all we are is obsessed with delivering the lowest price to the consumer, then we will let that happen, and domestic producers in the UK will suffer.
Yeah, thank you. There were 200 tractors descending on my constituency a week or so ago because farmers are just fed up of cheap imports, to be honest, and they really are struggling to make ends meet. Okay, so producers have told us that significant increases in the costs of production are not being reflected in farm gate prices and that they're largely price takers. Is this an accurate reflection of the relationship between producers and manufacturers? And I'm just thinking of apples in Kent, for example. The storage of them and all those kinds of things are costing so much money. I don't care who starts, Rod. Do you want to...
I think we need to get much closer to the farmer. I think in all of this, if you develop a food strategy, the starting point is the farmer. I'm not saying that's all you think about, but the starting point has to be the farmer because they are at the start of that process. And honestly, if you read anything about the day-to-day life of a farmer, you will realise just how many costs are involved in running their farms, not just staffing, but also, you know, getting around. I mean, the concept that you can always sell your food at farmers markets, for example. You might be in the middle of nowhere. The nearest market might be miles away. You know, transportation of product involved in that, marketing your products. So you are to a certain extent held hostage by the environment that you're in, and you know that will pile costs on you and added complexity, and also restrict your market to a certain extent, who you can feasibly sell to, and all of those costs. Yeah, I mean, storage costs, staffing costs, you know, obviously cost of fertilizer, you know, all the feed costs. All of those things have to be kind of factored in. But there are so many costs, hidden costs and complexities that I don't think a lot of people would understand.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to jump in on that one? Peter.
So I just elaborate a bit further. I mean, essentially as a country, we have opted to use the market to organise the agri-food sector. And if you deregulate markets or you move away from managed markets, which is what we have done, then you end up with price volatility. Now, as I said, there are some mechanisms in the dairy industry to protect farmers from that volatility, like in aligned supply chains. And also, if companies have, you know, strong brand proposition in the marketplace, they can do what they can to try and protect their supplying farmers, but there's a limit to their financial capability of doing so. So ultimately, at the end of the supply chain, yes, farmers are in a position where they are very much price takers. And it is very much a result of this global pricing dynamic and the fact that farmers are producing a commodity-type product. It is almost relatively inescapable. The industry is doing what it can to add value to try and protect farmers as much as it can, but unfortunately farmers do get the lows, and the current situation is prices are below the cost of production for many farmers, but on the other hand they do get the highs. In 2022, dairy farmers had the highest prices on record. But it's balancing out those highs and lows and, you know, maintaining their position over those cycles. That's the challenge.
I think, if I may, Rosie, it's certainly not easy, but there is an ability to sell forward and to buy forward. So there are opportunities for farmers to buy their inputs forward at an agreed price. On grains, there are opportunities to sell forward at an agreed price. So they can manage some of that volatility and that risk by entering into forward contracts. But, of course, that's down to the individual to choose, and that doesn't apply across all aspects of farm marketing.
Thank you. Specifically to Peter, you've argued that there's a high degree of competition between processors for raw milk, which ensures a fair price for farmers, and that processors try to shield farmers from extreme price movements. But we've heard that dairy farmers can usually only sell to one processor and are often receiving less for a litre of milk than it costs to produce. How would you respond to that?
I would contest the assertion that farmers only have one processor to sell to. If you look at a map of the disposition of the dairy industry, location of dairy farming and the processing sites, you can see that towards the west side of the country, where most of the dairy farmers are located, they, on most occasions, have a fair degree of choice who they can supply. So most of them are in a locally competitive raw milk market. So I don't think it's a case that they only have one option. It may be true on the east side of the country, but there are very few dairy farmers left in that part of the country. So I would contest that proposition. But in terms of do milk prices fall below the cost of production? As I've said earlier, there are occasions in the price cycle where that unfortunately does happen. But that's the inevitable outcome of having a market-driven industry.
Do you think supermarkets are better than they were when we all saw, I think it was Asda, cows being walked into the supermarkets, which I think peaked the nation really as to what the problems were? Do you think things have improved since then?
Well, I think if you look at the way supermarkets operate their line supply chains for liquid drinking milk, then they've obviously made a commitment to underwrite the cost of production for that portion of farmers, but they haven't chosen to do for other dairy products because there's an alternative source of supplies coming in to the UK from outside the country. So there isn't a necessity to invest in security of supply, which is the reason that they did it in the first place. And I think also retailers are acutely conscious that They would like to, if it's possible, to take a longer-term view, and they have made strong commitments in some areas to industry sustainability, but they are constrained by their own competition in their marketplace and their own competitive pressures, so they can't go as far as many of them would like to because they're in fierce competition with each other.
Thanks very much, Willie. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I was interested in what you're saying, Peter, about the sort of the global market and the way that can be very volatile. I mean, we didn't always have that situation in the UK. We had the Milk Marketing Board. Farmers had to sell to one purchaser. They were limited how much they could produce by a quota system put upon them. And if we produced too much, then it just went into butter mountains and milk powder stores as well. I mean, was that system one that you'd like to return to?
Well, I mean, that system was a combination of domestic structures like the milk marketing scheme. It was a common agricultural policy. It was quotas, intervention purchasing, export subsidies, consumption subsidies. It was an entire architecture designed to try and stabilise prices to producers. And as a matter of policy, both the governments in the European Union, the European Commission and governments in this country has been disassembling that market management mechanism, and it has taken us a great length of time to do it, and also sort out what was basically a botched deregulation of the milk marketing scheme at the end of the last century. So we've only now got to a state where the industry has a proper integration of supply chains, greater degree of cooperation between farmers and processors, and a better portfolio of branded products. And it's taken us a long time to get there, so I don't think there's any keenness to go back to a system which is in itself seemed to be very wasteful and very inefficient and putting an unnecessary burden on the taxpayer.
Would you say that British farmers are at a disadvantage because we've got Arla, which is a big farmer cooperative, but by and large farmers don't cooperate in the same way they do in some European countries? Does that mean farmers have less power generally, would you say?
Well, it's not just Arla. There are other cooperatives in the UK. You've got First Milk, Dale Farm, Long Clawson, South Carnarvon Creameries. If you add it all up, the amount of milk going to dairy co-ops in the country is about 40%. So that's quite a significant market share. So there isn't any fundamental difference in the behaviour now between the co-ops and the private dairy companies. They all have to respond to each other. Nobody can play fast and loose. So I think the farmers can be reasonably confident of their structural position in the supply chain.
Understood. Rosie, you wanted a quick supplementary.
Got to do this, I'm afraid, Chair. But would anyone on the panel be able to tell us, as a committee, that Brexit has made this vicious circle easier, less complicated for everybody in all bits of the supply chain? Would anyone actually say it's got better or easier?
That's not the point, is it?
I don't think it's got any worse because the volatility started when we were a member of the European Union. I mean, if you want to go over in the history of the dairy industry, we suffered volatility once the European Union scrapped export subsidies. That's when it started. That's when we became fully exposed to the world market. So we've had volatility before we had Brexit. I mean, the implications of Brexit, the problems of Brexit is higher export administration costs. But other than that, it hasn't fundamentally changed the dynamic of the marketplace. There may be impacts arising from the free trade agreements we've negotiated, but they've yet to come through on dairy. At the moment, Australia and New Zealand haven't shown a great interest in this market, but geopolitical events may change their mind.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just to sort of perhaps come in with a slightly different perspective, I suppose. For us, our members deal with tariff and non-tariff barriers all the time, and it has been the mother of all headaches, frankly, for them from word one post-Brexit. I think I would say I would potentially have been able to buy into Brexit if there had ever been a plan. But it is patently obvious that there was no plan from the beginning. And that, I think, is heinous, frankly. So going back to this having a national food strategy, God's sake, if you're going to do something like that, put a plan in place first, because I think a lot of what you're seeing as the outworking of this is the fact there was no plan from the beginning, and that tells a story of itself.
Okay, I think we're in danger of departing from the fairness in the food supply chain to bigger issues which have been debated in this place at length, you probably realise. Derek, do you want to...
Very briefly to Peter. So this may not be relevant, but the new arrangements around exclusivity of dairy contracts, I think, might become into legislation in the next few weeks. Would that help or hinder some of the problems you've set out today in terms of the relationship between dairy, the herd themselves, and the producers?
We don't see that it should drive any great fundamental change in relationships between processors and dairy farmers. The objective behind the regulation is the greater transparency in the price-setting process, that farmers should have a better understanding of the reasons as to why prices are changing. And as such, it provides them with a mechanism that if a purchaser is using a variable price mechanism, that the dairy farmer can have set out in the contract the factors that are going to be used to determine those price changes, and can request an explanation as to what role those factors played for any given price change that they're subject to. Then it gives them a dispute resolution procedure, and then it gives them an opportunity to raise a complaint to the Secretary of State. So it's really more about information and transparency than changing the fundamental market dynamics between the two parties.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Cheryl.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'd like to turn to the Agricultural Act, which of course wouldn't have been in place had it not been for leaving the European Union. So obviously our colleagues opposite have a different view to me, but I actually think it's really good.
Keep the subject.
I am, Chairman, the Agricultural Act. Is the government making the best use of the fair dealing clause in the Agricultural Act to promote fairer contractual practices throughout the food supply chain? Of course, we can do that now, which we couldn't before. Can I go to you first, please, Peter?
Well, the first sector in which they've opted to make use of that power is the dairy industry, and the statutory instrument has been laid before Parliament, and I understand it's just being debated and will come into force relatively soon. So I hesitate to use the term, we're going to be the guinea pig for other sectors, which I understand the government wants to roll out this template. And also, we're going to be the first in which an adjudicator is going to be appointed to oversee any complaints that have been raised within the framework of the regulation. That potentially may be a point of concern, because what we don't as a sector want to see is a politicisation of the price-setting process. We'd want the adjudicator to stick strictly to within the remit of interpreting the regulations and not get involved as to recommendations as to what would constitute an ideal or a fair price. It would just be operating the regulation as it stands. But we'll have to see how it pans out over time. What our immediate short-term ask from DEFRA is we want to see guidelines for the interpretation of the regulation. At the moment, our members do not have enough detail to actually draw up contracts to make them consistent with the requirements of this regulation. And until that guidance is available, they're waiting, which is going to possibly plunge the supply chain into some degree of uncertainty, because contracts may no longer be legal under certain deadlines within the regulation. So that's what we want to see in the immediate short term.
Do you have anything to add, Robert?
I'd only add, for many years, AIC has, in conjunction with farming organisations, had written contracts in place, and if the committee would like to see a copy of these, I'll very happily submit a copy afterwards.
Okay, and Rod, anything to add to that?
I think in general terms, nobody could argue with the foundation of the Agricultural Act, Part 3, clauses 21 to 26, better and more transparent data provision, subject to potential anonymity, lack of written contracts between. Obviously, yes, recognition there are written contracts now. I guess my biggest concern really is joined up thinking. Because we obviously have the Grocery Code adjudicator in place to police the supply chain. How is this Agricultural Act going to integrate with that, and how is the adjudicator in this case going to work with the GCA? I personally think the GCA as a model was fantastic. I think it's done tremendously well for the food chain generally. And I would be, I think a big part going forwards of a food plan would be, to lend further support in that area to ensure fairness. But the only slight pause for concern I would have is, are we in danger of duplicating things and laying legislation on legislation is there a way that we can look at existing legislation and make it work better, really?
And if I can continue with you, Rod, the government stated that the agricultural producers tend to be small and unconsolidated compared to actors further up the supply chain who have substantial market share. Do you share this assessment, and what impact does this have on profit and risk sharing along the supply chain?
Going back to what I was saying earlier, I think there are supply chain imbalances. Some of those are inherent in any kind of market capitalist system, to be honest. And I have no qualms with the way that our systems work in general in terms of competition. I think that there are ways to kind of build greater fairness in, but clearly if you are of a much smaller scale and you're dealing with somebody of a much bigger scale, it's a problem. I don't think the problems end there, just in terms of the power imbalance. I think there are ways that you could improve relations between, say, retailers and producers, and also big processors and suppliers. And one way at the retail end, for example, would be to encourage a relationship between buyers and their suppliers that spans a period of time, because I think there's a lot of churn in buyers in retail, and the problem with that is that buyers then don't have much experience in dealing with suppliers and the kind of issues that they face. If there was a mentoring scheme in place, for example, to support them, or more experienced buyers that they could provide support in those areas, I think that would certainly help. And also possibly looking at actually kind of building in a longer term span of contract for a buyer. I understand, from the retail perspective, why they need to kind of move around to get some experience, but I think that would certainly help from the retail end. It is structural as well as just about size, I would say.
Thank you. And do you have a view on that, Robert?
I don't think I do directly, because that's third party. I think when you're trying to look at managing inflation, though, I would support, I think, a little bit of what Rod said earlier about having a land use strategy, because that way you start to give a very clear signal about encouraging inward investment in UK business, because then there's a confidence. Tie that up with food security, and then suddenly you've got a production base in the UK that knows what it's trying to do, knows the policy framework of what the wishes of government are, and then can meet that demand. And then whether that's internal investment or external investment, that's encouraged confidently to invest into the UK, and then you start to protect yourself from perhaps global volatility at that point, because you have a degree of home production which can help even out some of those shifts in global markets.
And Peter,
yes, thank you.
Obviously you have a lot of small producers.
Yes, there's about 10,000 dairy farmers, but I think there's already been discussed. A lot of them are organised in dairy cooperatives who are operating on their behalf, and that's about 40% of the milk. In addition to that, there's an intermediary organisational form called the producer organisation. This is where producers supplying a private dairy company can come together, create a single entity, and that entity then negotiates on their behalf with that buyer. And effectively, we've got two of those in the United Kingdom. That account also for a significant portion of milk. Then you've got informal supply chain arrangements between private dairy companies and their supplying farmers. So I think on balance in the dairy sectors, farmers are very strongly represented and they structurally have quite a strong position. So I don't think the question of the scale of individual farmers is so much of a problem in dairy as potentially in other sectors. But just perhaps building on the point also made about strategy and confidence, there is, our sector senses a lack of completeness in the framework we're operating in terms of government strategy. The one clear signal we're getting is that the government wants us to export more, but that's not sort of tied to any sort of production strategy. Do they want the dairy sector to grow, shrink, or stay the same? We don't really know, and I think it would help give confidence to dairy farmers and processors to invest if they knew exactly where they stood with the government's aspirations for the sector.
Thank you. And continuing just with you, Peter, The government has introduced regulations to promote greater fairness and transparency in the dairy sector, as you quite rightly said. You have argued that it is necessary that these allow producers to retain a degree of pricing flexibility. In your view, do the regulations strike the right balance, and why is the price flexibility so necessary?
On the whole, yes, we believe it does strike that right balance between greater transparency for the farmer, the producer, and maintaining flexibility for the processor, because the processor is selling into volatile markets. They're operating in a situation of uncertainty. It would be extremely difficult for dairy processors to commit to fixed prices for any great length of time. So you need to have a flexible pricing arrangement. What we've always wanted to avoid under the regulation is a requirement to use price formulas, where you just put data into a mathematical formula and a number falls out the other end, because no formula ever describes the vagaries of the world market as it actually unfolds. So as such, we think DEFRA has found the right balance between that aspiration for transparency whilst retaining the flexibility that both co-ops and private dairy companies need to compete in what is an international marketplace.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Just before we conclude, would you say, Rod, and I think I get the impression that you were saying this, that the powers of the grocery code adjudicator should be extended further through the supply chain rather than just those who deal directly with the supermarkets? And maybe do the supermarkets have a role to play in terms of taking a more long-term view on the way they do their purchasing, rather than maybe instructing their purchasers just to get the very best deal and not worry what's going to happen next year or the year after when the apples are being grubbed or the dairy herds are being sold?
Yes. I mean, I think there is scope for looking at extending the powers of the GCA. I think that would deal partly with having a coherent approach to the whole supply chain, because I think that's what you need, not kind of working in silos. Certainly the scope for extending the work to, as has been suggested before, not just by me, but to look at, say, big suppliers or more retailers. The online piece, obviously Amazon is being looked at by GCA, but consideration for other online retailers and so forth, because we are in that market now. So I think there is a piece around that. And then beyond that, yes, I mean, to your point about a different way of working from retailers themselves. I mean, there are good examples of where retailers are working well and reinvesting and supporting suppliers. And I think they provide models and examples that could be used. So, for example, you have, in May 2022, Waitrose said it would cover the full cost of rearing and producing pigs, including labour. September 23, Lidl financially incentivising farmers to go into egg production. These are examples, of where you have retailers working with farmers and suppliers to a kind of joint end. And I think they are instructive.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for your evidence. We'll now move on to the second session.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to the second session of the EFRA Select Committee, where we're looking at fairness in the food supply chain. If I could ask our witnesses to introduce themselves, starting with Marc on my left.
Good afternoon, my name is Marc Woodward. I'm the head of country for Unilever in the UK. We're a UK headquartered global organisation, and we are proud to have served UK shoppers and consumers with a number of brands for over 100 years. Our business covers food and non-food, although food is about 40% of the UK business, with brands such as Commons and Marmite.
Thank you. Bas?
Good afternoon, my name is Bas Padberg. I'm working for Arla Foods since the last 10 years and since January this year responsible for Arla Foods UK. We are a farmer-owned cooperative with almost 2,000 farmers here in the United Kingdom, where we collect every day our milk and we process that together with our farmers into our delicious products of milk, butter, cheese. Thank you. Yeah.
Sarah?
Good afternoon, I'm Sarah Arrowsmith. I'm the Chief Executive of ABF's UK Grocery Division. My division consists of a number of businesses making a variety of staple foodstuffs, such as Allied Bakeries, who make Kingsmill and Allinson's, World Foods, who have Patak's and Blue Dragon, Jordan's Dorset Ryvita, who make cereals and savoury crackers. We make brands and retailer brands, and we supply all of the UK retail and food service business. We have 25 sites across the UK and employ about 5,300 people.
Dominic.
Hi, I'm Dominic Hawkins. I'm the Supply Chain Director for Northern Europe at Kraft Heinz. Like a lot of my colleagues you've heard here today, we're proud to manufacture a lot of food in the UK. We have 3 large sites in the UK at Kit Green, Telford and Worcester, making brands that we've been selling here for well over 100 years, Heinz, HP and Liam Perrins.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but we've had 2 of your organisations have made announcements today. Arla have announced a £179 million investment in the UK. We're very grateful for that confidence in the UK economy and 192 new jobs. But Unilever, we read, have announced globally that they'll be cutting 7,500 jobs and spinning off the ice cream business. I mean, is that because of global trends or competition?
So the Global Board have announced today that they are going to focus on the ice cream business in a new way. It's actually a different supply chain in many ways. It's a frozen supply chain. The seasonality of the business makes it slightly different, with a much bigger emphasis on summer. And the view is that we can do much better focusing on that piece of business by treating it as a standalone organisation. It will remain as part of Unilever, but it will stand alone.
Okay, understood. So the 7,500 jobs globally will be not lost but transferred to the new sort of standalone ice cream business. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, on this, I must say that it was only announced this morning.
Yeah, well,
given it's price sensitive, I'm still in a position where I'm understanding how this is going to work. For context, it is 7,500 jobs across the globe. We employ about 128,000 people across the globe. And it will take a little time before we understand exactly what the implications of that were going to be.
Will there be any impact on the UK jobs in that regard?
That's something which, at this stage, it's too early to tell. When I do get an understanding of what that will be, I would want to discuss that first and foremost and consult with people in the UK. The focus will be, I think, on head office staff in the main, but it's a global programme, not focused on the UK.
Okay. So the announcement was made this morning, obviously disconnected. It wasn't that you wanted us to ask you about it today particularly.
I think that's fair, yes.
Thank you very much indeed. Maybe you could write to us when you do know a little bit more about the UK impact. Would be useful. Derek, would you like to start the questions?
Yeah, thanks. It's nice that this select committee has such powers over a global company. So this is to anybody who wants to chip in first. How long have the high rates of food price inflation experienced in recent years affected your company, and how do you expect prices to change in the short and medium term? I think everyone's interested in that. So I don't know who wants to start. So basically, how has it impacted you so far? How do you expect it to look in the short and medium term? Dominic, you're looking keen.
Yeah, I can go first on that one. So look, it's a great and very important question, right? And an area that preoccupies us. I think we went through a very long period of relatively stable pricing in the UK. I think we heard it referenced at the beginning of the last session that probably for the 10 or 13 years running up to maybe the beginning of the pandemic, we saw quite stable rates of inflation and relatively stable rates of food pricing. If I look at what's happened to both us and a lot of the industry, what we have seen is a big change since 2020-21, driven by 2 or 3 key factors. So the pandemic and the impact on global shipping had a significant impact on the cost of moving goods around the world. And it's worth saying we have a really global supply chain. So a lot of our key commodities that we use to manufacture products in the UK come from a long way afield. So tomatoes from places like California and the continent, or the beans that go in baked beans predominantly come from North America and the Great Lakes area. So things like transport has a big impact. The war in Ukraine clearly had a very significant impact, as well as other geopolitical or policy changes, like some of the additional complexity we see with tariff and non-tariff barriers post-Brexit. To answer the second part of your question, looking forward, what we have seen is some easing in inflation over the last year, and we take the opportunity when we do that to start to look at how we can reinvest to make sure that our products are as competitive as possible. So if you were to look at shelf prices for some of our products today, you would see that we've invested very deliberately over the last 6 months to make sure that they're as competitive as possible for our consumers. So to answer your question, a long period or a 2 or 3 year period where we've seen very significant inflation, some easing of that, but I wouldn't say that means there's deflation in most of our key commodities. They're still significantly more expensive than they were certainly pre-pandemic and pre-war in Ukraine. But as we get the opportunity, we now invest in prices to make sure that we're able to remain competitive for our consumers.
With those, not necessarily Dominic, but anyone who wants to answer, but when you see the prices go as they have done, quite big significant increases, does that change your business model so that you actually don't invest in the business as much as you would normally, or do you actually try and invest in the business in order to get the prices more realistic? I don't know if Baz, if you wanted to pick up on that.
Yeah, just to comment a little bit on your earlier question, I think where it really starts for all of us in terms of food and price inflation, it starts at the farm. Yeah. And that's really where it started in 22, given by the same reasons as just described. I mean, cost on farm has exploded in that year. Fertilizers have increased. I'm looking at it here, 59%. Petrol has increased 29%. The cost of feed has increased 14%. And it's very simple with a farmer. If they don't get paid the price they need, they can't continue to farm. That's really where it presses. That's also for us the necessity to actually bring those costs to the retailers, and that's, I think, the whole tension, let's say, and that sits in the supply chain, because at the end of the day, we all want the same favor, and that's the favor of the consumer buying an affordable, good quality product. And this is where then the competition in the supply chain starts, from the cost at the bottom versus competing for the favor of the consumer. I think moving forward on that, our assumption is volatility will remain to be there. It will not go away. We will have higher highs and lower lows in terms of milk price and global trading. That's some of my other witnesses have just explained here earlier before. So working on partnerships with retail is very important for us to get stability in the supply chain, because at the end of the day, the farmer needs to get a fair price. Otherwise, it's not sustainable.
Yeah. So for Arla, then, in terms of what we saw with milk, it actually started to get what I suspect was probably the right price rather than an expensive price. So with the milk price, was it you determining the price both to the retailer and to the farmer, or was it global supply? What was actually determining that increase in the price of milk to consumers?
Actually, in 22, it happened almost simultaneously. I think if you look at the volatility, what happened there with the whole situation now in the Ukraine, that was like a situation that was never seen before. So the rally of prices going up was unusual, very unusual, and I've never seen before. And if it's that high, then there is no other way than taking price increases. It's as simple as that. If it's just a few percent, then sometimes you can manage it. But with these kinds of increases, there's no other way than to increase prices.
So I hear that, and I don't want to prolong this too long, but farmers will always tell us that they get paid quite often, certainly before the recent increases, less than the price of production. But that hasn't necessarily put the prices up in supermarkets. You get a flurry of activity, and Morrison's and others might put up a 10p on a litre in order for the farmers to get more. But how can you be confident going forward that as milk and dairy prices come down, that farmers aren't going to be plunged, if they're not already, back into producing milk less than the cost of their cost of production?
Yeah, I think our view on moving forward is actually what the company is doing now. We have organized ourselves as a big dairy cooperative, where we can actually spread our risks and businesses around different parts in the world. So Hans, the announcement this morning as well, where we are starting investing here in the UK in a state-of-the-art factory that would allow us to sell great products here in the UK, but also outside of the UK, so that we have options to manage to get the best possible price for our farmers. So playing at those different levels would allow us to better deal with that situation.
So iron out the pits and the troughs, the peaks and the troughs. Sarah, can I ask you a question in terms of your particular area? So ONS data showed that annual food price inflation for breakfast cereals had increased by 8.7%. How much have your production costs for Dorset cereals, for example, increased? And what has driven these increases? And what has the retail prices increased by? Is there kind of a comparison between your input costs and the price on the shelf?
So the main cause of the increase in Dorset, which is a muesli, is the base grains inflation, which is the same as the colleagues have just spoken about. So we've had base grain inflation, and then we've had some really significant inflation in fruit and nuts as well. Vine fruits have almost doubled in price because of the droughts in Turkey, particularly because most vine fruits come from Turkey. So there's been really significant inflation. I think our input inflation is running around 18% for Dorset. What we've had to do on a number of our Dorset packs is actually we spoke to our consumers, and what we discovered was that actually they couldn't and wouldn't pay the necessary price. So we took our pack size down so that we tried to hit a price point that consumers were prepared to pay. We didn't change the 100 gram, pence per 100 gram. We just made the boxes smaller, so it was an affordable price for consumers. Oats have continued to go up. Although we've seen grain prices come down, we've actually seen oat prices continue to increase because there was a smaller acreage of oats that was grown last year.
Yeah. Still above you, there is the retail. The
retailers choose the retail price. We have no influence over the retail price.
How prepared are you to suggest whether what they're charging reflects your increased costs or not?
Broadly speaking, it does. The challenge, as Abbas said, was where there are small increases, then the producers in the middle end up absorbing small increases. Very large increases, there's nothing we can do. We have to pass those on.
Sure. So, can I come back to you? So ONS data also showed that prices for whole milk and butter are in deflationary territory, which kind of I hinted at earlier. Are you seeing processing costs and manufacturing costs decrease in relation to the production of these items? I know you're trying to create a smarter business to allow that to happen, but are you seeing are farmers and are you seeing that it's costing less to produce the milk so that actually the shelf price is more reflective of what it's costing?
I wouldn't see how it's going to cost less to produce milk. I mean, energy cost is still higher, labor cost is still increasing. So it's not less. I mean, the way we're dealing with it is that we're running a program that we target to really deal with the efficiencies in our companies, so to really start to reduce cost. And that's where size helps in order to become efficient and not to pass on cost increases that actually sits in our supply chain. So that's how we deal with it. Is we have annual efficiency programs to deal with the cost.
Yeah. So I said earlier that actually it could be the case that we started paying the right price for milk rather than a below market producer cost of production price. Did we gain anything by that, or actually do you still feel the pressure of consumers and retailers that just assume and expect milk to be cheap, even to be cheaper than bottled water?
I think what we've gained, and it's not over yet, right, is the awareness of the cost of food. Yeah. I think the whole industry has gained with that, is that food has a cost price. And that the global food chain is actually very much connected to each other. So if there's one issue somewhere, it impacts the total food market. We've seen that in the situation in Ukraine. It starts a whole domino on it. So I think the big gain that we have is the awareness of food and the cost of food and the relevance of the efficiency of producing food in order to keep it affordable. I think that's the biggest gain that we have now. And there was an opportunity for us to kind of, how do we come out stronger in this? And call it a fair price or a good price. Yeah. But it's a sustainable price where farmers, but every player in the value chain, I would say, can actually continue to invest in the future, also on all of the sustainability matters that are coming our way.
I'm a West Cornwall MP, and we have Arla badges on the end of gates, end of drives all over the place. But I'm getting the impression locally that actually some dairy farmers, or some farmers, are getting out of dairy altogether. Are you seeing that, and is it just that you're getting bigger and bigger dairy herds, or is it still quite spread across the country?
I'm in a fortunate position is that I don't recognize that within the Arla co-op, but of course I hear it. I'm in the market, so I hear it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Harry.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know what your public affairs people said to you before you came in today. I know that the committee clerks had to ask your companies a number of times to get somebody to come before us today. But I just want to remind you that as witnesses before this committee, if you were to give false, misleading or incomplete information and evidence to the committee, then on the face of it, that would be contempt of Parliament. And I want to start off by setting out what the public feel, because you've confected this issue around the previous responses you've given about how it's tough out there. But the thing is, when the public looks at your companies, they know it's been tough out there, but they don't know it's been tough for you. 8 out of the top 10 food manufacturers, including Unilever, including Associated British Foods, made £23 billion of profit in post-pandemic to pre-pandemic. And only 11% of public limited companies actually saw their profits increase during that period. Now, the public look at this and they say, well, we understand all the things that you've said about Ukraine, all the things that you've said about the pandemic and all the shocks that have taken place. And they're fair-minded. And they look and they say, well, look, fine. If the input costs have increased, we expect that those will be passed on, as you've suggested. But if all you were doing was passing on the input costs, the increased costs of your supply chain, then they expect your profits to stay roughly the same. But Mr. Hawkins, if I look at the report from IPPR that looked at your company, Kraft, during the period it saw your profits rise from 265 million to 1.8 billion. That's a 6.79 times as much profit. How do you justify that to the family that is struggling?
I think that's directed at me, actually. Sorry.
Kraft. Yeah. Sorry, I've got you mixed up.
Sorry, the name. Apologies, maybe the names are the wrong way around. So I think you're referring to our global profit numbers there, not our UK entity numbers. So I can't comment on the specifics.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think IPPR was simply looking at the UK because your global figures were more. Your global figures were up in about 6.8 billion, weren't they?
So it's worth saying that our corporate setup means that we have different entities in different regions and locales. We can reply in writing to that. It's quite a complex topic.
I'd like you to reply now, because you owe it to this committee. You knew what you were coming here for. You knew that we were, concerned about GDP, gouging, greedflation, profiteering. You knew that was what you were going to be drilled on, so please give me the answer now, not in some letter later on when it's not in the public eye.
I understand. So look, there's two things I can say, and what's important to say is, firstly, we've always passed on less than the input inflation we've seen. So if I give you some examples of that, and we look at some specifics around the inflation we've seen in our input costs, in the years from 2021 to 2023, we've seen a 16% increase in the cost of our beans. We've seen a 101% increase in the cost of our tomatoes, which is a key ingredient both in our beans and tomato ketchup. And we've seen around a 50% increase in the cost of tin plate, which we use to manufacture our tins. So what I can assure the committee on is, on a percentage basis, we've put through less cost price increases than we've seen as our input inflation.
So how have you made not quite, but almost 7 times the profit, the annualised profit? 6.79 times.
I think if you're looking at an EBITDA basis, on an annualised basis, there are lots of other things in there, including one-offs. Again, what I'll come back to reinforce the point is, when we look at the input costs and then the inflation that we've passed on less on a percentage basis than we've seen on input costs. There are lots of other factors that make up an EBITDA or a bottom line profit that aren't necessarily directly associated with that, including one-off costs.
So what's your message to the public who love your products? They buy your products. In fact, sometimes you even use them as leverage with the supermarkets to say that you won't allow them to stock your products unless they give you a better price. So, what's your message to them to explain why your profits are 7 times what they were?
Look, I think what I would say, and what again is important to remember, we really do remain committed to offering tasty, nutritious and high quality products to our consumers. I'll also reinforce the point I made earlier to your colleague, that as we've seen inflation ease off, we have reinvested in price to our consumers. So to reinforce a couple of key points here, one, we've never put through more inflation than we've seen as input costs. And then secondly, you could go and look in Ocado, you could look in Sainsbury's, you could look in Tesco, and what you'll have seen in recent months is a reduction in promotional pricing on our key products to help bring prices down for our consumers in recent months.
Yes, but actually, if you look at the 3 major supermarkets in this country, you'll also know that, again, pre-pandemic profits and post-pandemic profits, their profit margins afterwards rose by 97%. So by saying, look, things are now coming down there, yes, but the same has applied to them. We even had the situation on Laura Kunsberg. You'll remember one morning when one of the, I think it was the chairman of one of the supermarkets, had admitted that gouging was going on in the sector. He didn't actually say it for his own company, but he said it was going on in the sector. So are you really sitting there and telling us, no, there is no such thing as gouging, there's no such thing as greedflation, there's no such thing as profiteering? It all just happens to be the case that at a time when the public is under this huge pressure and stress in the economy, we just happen to be making, in some cases, the best profits we've ever made. I mean, if you look at Cargill, not one of you sitting here, but the record profits in 157 years. You're not taking advantage of the situation to gouge? Is that what you're really telling us?
Look, there's several things I'd say. Firstly, I can't comment on supermarket profits.
You did. You just passed it on. You deflected my question and started talking about the supermarket. So don't say you can't talk about them.
With respect, I would disagree with that. What I reference with the supermarkets is the prices that we've helped to pass on to consumers as we've reinvested in price. I can't comment on either Cargill, who are not one of our suppliers to my knowledge, nor can I comment specifically on supermarket profits. And I understand you've got a later session with supermarkets approaching in the coming weeks. So, look, what I can say, and I'll reinforce the point again, we have passed on less inflation than we've seen in our input costs over the period from before the pandemic, so let's say 2019, 2020 to today. And again, as we've seen inflation eased, not come down, because on some of our most key commodities, we're the world's largest procurer of tomatoes. We continue to see inflation there, predominantly driven by issues such as climate change. But we have consistently passed on less price than we've seen in input inflation.
What's given you that huge rise in your profits? What's given you that extra £1.5 billion?
So,
good luck.
With respect, I'm not sure which period you're referring to there when you talk
Period
about one.
IPPR we're looking at, and it was IPPR and Commonwealth in their report. I'm sure you must have been briefed on this. Coming into this committee, don't tell me that your public affairs people did not say, look, you better read this before you go in there because some mug is going to get you on it.
Okay. So, look, I'm not aware of the specific numbers you're talking about. Again, I will come back to the point. There are lots of one-offs that can affect profit on an individual year. And if you look at, again, the inflation that we've seen as input and the price that we've passed on, what that would indicate is that we've not passed on more price than we've seen as an inflation in our costs. If I refer to some of the things that you've heard from our other panel members today, clearly we do have things like efficiency programs, but the bigger impact tends to be things like one-offs on an annualised basis if you're comparing profit from one period to another. And certainly if you're looking after profit after tax, in a publicly listed company or a limited company as we have in our UK entity, there are lots of one-off variables that can affect that won't necessarily mean you're comparing like with like on a year-to-year basis if you're talking purely from an inflation perspective.
No, they wouldn't. So we would have to look at your profit margins over a period of time, wouldn't we? Yeah. Mr. Woodward, if I can turn to you and Unilever. You've reported a rise in pre-tax profit of 21% for the first half of 2023, but your company's claimed that it has not been profiteering in any form from rising prices. So perhaps you could tell me how you have tried to protect the consumer, how you've tried to ensure that you pass on less than the price rises that you've experienced in the same way as Mr. Hawkins has.
Absolutely. So I would concur from our point of view, we only ever pass through pricing as a last resort. It's certainly not the first place that we would go. We look within our own organisations to save costs first.
Surely you look in the first instance to make profit, and you've made hugely increased profits. I mean, in 1 year, the jump was from 5.1 billion to 6.5 billion.
If I just take a step back, the UK market is incredibly competitive, and I sit here alongside some of my competitors who have brands in the same categories that we do. We are acutely aware of how sensitive price is at the moment and value, and you simply cannot run a successful organisation in this market by pushing forward prices that are not justified. So we always look at other ways before we go to market with cost price increases, and after a period of stability which has been discussed.
Look, Arla's sitting next to you there, right? If we go to their net margins over the past few years, 3%, 3%, 2.8%, right? Let's go to your net margins. 10.8%, 11.5%, 12.7%. They're going up. They're huge and they're going up. This is not just, this year on a one-off basis we managed to, reduce our costs phenomenally. No, actually, this is huge. I mean, we have the regulated industries before us. If they're making 2% a year, we think, we better look at them more carefully. These are huge net margins, aren't they?
I could refer to the UK statutory accounts, which I'm not familiar with the numbers that you're coming up with, but I do have published accounts for the UK. We've got very static turnover since 2017 in this market of about £1.8 billion. Our operating margin, which I think is the margin to which you are referring, is actually relatively static at around between 4.5% and 6% in the UK. Last year, we actually made our operating profits in the UK went down. So if you check the statutory accounts, they went down, and we made an operating profit of 4.5% in this market. So I don't recognise the numbers that you're talking about.
You know, one of the worst things of sitting on this committee is that sometimes we just get down to trading statistics. And nobody out there who watches these proceedings is ever impressed by that. I come back to the main point. 11%, just 11% of publicly listed companies saw their profits increase. Yours did. And the public are suffering, and they look at your companies and they think not just, why aren't these guys helping us? They think, we're owed a bloody apology. You've been taking us for mugs. Arrowsmith. ABP, Associated British Foods.
As far as my division is concerned, we supply safe, affordable, nutritious food, and we supply across a range of different product areas. If you take our bread business, for example, as was confirmed by the CMA investigation, we make negative margins on bread. And that's because we're price takers in the market. We take the price of grain, and it's a very competitive marketplace. There is oversupply in the market, so retailers have a choice.
Great example.
So therefore, we're working really hard to increase a margin in that product because it's a negative margin. In our other products, again, we haven't taken like my fellow people on the panel. We haven't taken as much inflation as we have taken, we've absorbed. We've absorbed a great deal of our cost increases, and we've worked with our customers and our businesses to try and take cost out of the supply chain in terms of delivering a little less frequently or delivering a different mix of product. We're filling lorries better. We are going to very small stores with our bread slightly less frequently, just to try and take some cost out to keep our products affordable for our consumers. We talk to our consumers all the time. So we're forever talking to our consumers because this is a really competitive marketplace. And if our consumers don't like our products, they won't buy them. They'll go somewhere else.
I just want to say I do have to leave. I'm not leaving in a peak. I'm not leaving in disgust. So I do have to leave to go to another committee. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Barry. Kat.
Thank you, Chair. And carrying on from Mr Gardner's comments there about the pressures on consumers, I just wondered if any of the panel wanted to share what percentage of the UK population they think have used a food bank in the last year.
I don't know the number, but I do know that it's shockingly high. And we supply a number of food banks with food that we redistribute, and the number is much higher than it should be.
It is much higher than it should be. It should be obviously zero, because nobody should be relying on food banks, not least those that are actually going out to work, and many of whom finish a shift in a hospital working as a nurse and then go to a food bank on the way home. 4% is the figure that have used a food bank to feed them or their family in the last year. And if you look at actual food poverty, of course, is much higher, because the point by which someone's accessing a food bank is a point of absolute desperation. We know that 7% of people have fed other members of their household ahead of themselves. That's usually a parent skipping a meal in order to feed a child in the family, or someone with a disability in their family, or someone who's vulnerable in their family. So consumers obviously know that they have to shop around, they have to be smart, but they don't appreciate it when they feel like they've been conned. And 77% of people have experienced shrinkflation when they've been doing their grocery shopping. And people feel like it's a con. I just wondered if any member of the panel wanted to respond to the way in which this is done in a way that's not transparent and is not overtly done, and often feels like, from the consumer's point of view, as if they're having the wool pulled over their eyes.
I can start with that. Look, as Kraft Heinz, clearly consumers' perception of value is really important. We haven't engaged in what you term shrinkflation of product sizes, although we have a whole range of different product sizes. What we haven't engaged in is downsizing of products whilst maintaining price. To my knowledge, we did check this beforehand. We can't see that we've changed pack sizes specifically on products to manage pricing. Clearly, we've talked about pricing a lot already today, but not something we do. The other bit that I'd flag is we do see the problems that you talk with food poverty. We are a big supporter of a number of charities that we feel very strongly about, including Magic Breakfast, supporting breakfasts into schools for those that suffer from food poverty. And as some of my other peers have talked about here, we do also support various food banks, both in the communities we operate in and nationally.
So Kraft Heinz didn't decrease the volume of beans in the 415 grams from 51% beans to 50% this year, meaning a 4 gram reduction in beans.
So I think if you look at that specific example, that wasn't a deliberate reduction in it. What we did do... But
it's definitely a reduction in the...
No, it's well within a normal tolerance for what was in beans. We didn't deliberately reduce the number of beans in the tin. We did reformulate based on what our consumers wanted. There wasn't a cost or efficiency saving driven by the number of beans in the can that you see in that particular report. We did change our recipe to make it taste better based on testing with consumers to improve the quality of our product. There wasn't a particular shrinkflation initiative to reduce the beans in the can. It's also worth saying the things that's replaced with, such as tomato and other ingredients, aren't necessarily cheaper.
Is the sauce more expensive than the beans, or the other way around?
It depends which component of the sauce, and I'd probably have to come back in writing on that. It's also slightly commercially sensitive, but the report that you saw on the change in the number of beans in the can wasn't something that we did as an efficiency saving, and actually there's a tolerance of the number of beans in the can that may vary slightly from can to can in any case.
And I'm aware that Mr. Padberg, Lurpak butters were shrunk 20%, so the which has found that Lurpak butter shrunk 20% in July 2023. You've gone from 250 grams to 200 grams. But Arla also then lowered the recommended price for the retailer to sell its 250 gram packs by 20%. I just wondered, why did the cooperative make that decision to lower the sizes and prices, and how much power do you have in ensuring that retailers are actually going to follow your recommendation, or are you finding that retailers are not following your recommendation on price?
Yeah, I think, an answer on your first part of the question is that we've done it. We've taken, if you look at our biggest item, which is Lurpak spreadable, which we had as a 500 gram, we've taken that to a 400 gram, but we have equally reduced the price of that. So it was purely an adjustment of what we call the out-of-pocket price, so what consumers actually pay for a pack of that. We have not taken any price increase at that moment in time. So it's really trying to serve consumers that are tightening their belts, basically, at the end of the month, to try to service them, is to allow them to continue to get access to the product. And that was effective in that sense. If we have enough power, I from an Arla point of view, I think the power for us is pretty balanced in the value chain. I think retailers are strong enough, and our brand is strong enough to effectively operate as supplier and customer. Yeah. So, but that's why we have done it. So we have lowered it to allow consumers to continue to buy it. But we have not taken a price increase at that moment.
I'm wondering, I've been in supermarkets and seen your products, Lurpak, with security tags in, either in the secure boxes or with the stickers on.
We were not happy with that as well.
How that makes you feel?
As I just said, we were not happy with that as well.
Mm-hmm. But how does that make you feel? In terms of the moral case, because the reality is that there are people starving in this country, and there really shouldn't be. And I just wonder how that makes you feel when you see your products that are clearly so sought after and needed that they have to be in security packs.
Of course, doesn't it's not that we want it. It is what I described when your colleague was asking questions earlier. If our farmers get a 59% cost increase on their cost, if I don't pass this on, they will not survive. Without farmers, no food.
Can I move on to yourself, Marc, about Hellmann's mayonnaise? Because the Grocery Gazette reported last year that Hellmann's mayonnaise jars have been reduced from 800 to 600 grams and were costing 9 pence more per 100 grams. Just wondered what the rationale was for those changes, and I wondered how you think it benefits consumers.
Yeah, can I just say up front, I completely can share your concerns on growth of food banks, and from a Unilever perspective, we've been working with Fair Share, and since 2022 we've actually donated 6 million products into food banks all across the country, but I absolutely share your concerns, so just to recognise that up front. In terms of sizing our products, we do offer multiple sizing across all our brands, and It isn't the primary place that we would go to look to pass on inflation that we experience, as we've talked about before. We're always looking to find a balance of entry price points that represent good value, and that's value and quality. On a brand like Hellmann's, we actually make sure that we stay in jars, even though glass is more expensive. We buy free-range eggs, and we're the first company to only buy free-range eggs, even though they're more expensive. But we want to offer that product in different sizes, for different occasions and for different price points. So to answer your question, we also have a 400 gram, 600 gram and an 800 gram in the marketplace, and we try and offer value which is with a discount curve where you get better value in the bigger packs, but that there's a really good value at an entry price point as well.
But would you concede that reducing the size of those jars is shrinkflation?
We look at, as I said before, we would never go to using just a pack size to achieve a price if it wasn't justified through the cost.
So it wasn't a case that you were reducing from 800 grams to 600 grams on your...
In the case of Hellmann's mayonnaise, as others have said, if I just give you some facts behind it, and maybe it'll reassure you, the cost of one of our main ingredients would be oils, sustainable rapeseed oil. That was up 80%. Our energy costs in that particular factory in Burton are up 100%.
Not really. I'm not disputing the fact that the price is going up for producing it. I'm not disputing that. What I'm kind of concerned about, and I'm hoping that you were going to reassure me about what I've so far not been reassured, is about the way in which when shrinkflation happens, when products are becoming more expensive to produce and are put into smaller packets or jars, and the way in which that's not communicated to consumers, and I'm concerned that consumers are being misled.
Okay.
Why are food producers not being more transparent about the fact that a packet of Dorset cereals has got smaller, or a jar of Hellmann's mayonnaise has got smaller? Why is that not more overt?
I can only speak for ourselves and not the others on the panel. Shoppers are super savvy and they exactly know what's going on, so we're completely transparent.
Some shoppers are super savvy, and some shoppers are really rushed off their feet and busy and stretched and juggling 4 jobs, single parenting, and do you know what? They haven't got time to look at how many grams of mayonnaise there is in a jar or how many grams of cereal there is in a box.
And because of that, we are transparent in any changes that we make on our pack size.
It's not transparent, is it?
We'll put it on our websites. We'll make sure we're clear about the grammage, and it's on all our tickets. So we try
it's
and
not
be,
on the packaging, is it? It's not on that shelf
transparent
edge. Perhaps it should be. Perhaps when a product changes the size of a packet or the jar, it should be on the shelf edge. It should be explicit, perhaps. Would you agree with that?
On shelf edge ticketing, you will find both the grammage and the price
No, but should it be when it's being shrunk?
So it is explicit.
It's in the small print on the label on the shelf, but when it's changed, when there's been a change in the size of the packaging, should that be a larger print? Should that be more explicit so that the consumer who is in a rush, who is juggling a crying baby and having to rush home to an elderly parent to care for them, can see that that jar of mayonnaise or any other product, I'm using mayonnaise because I'm asking you the question, but this has happened with other products as well, has changed and has shrunk? Should that be more explicit?
I think if we're not explicit and transparent in what we're doing, then consumers make a choice and they will choose not to buy your brands over time. If they don't feel they're getting value because you've not communicated correctly, then you miss an opportunity. And it's part of our role with our brands to make sure that we're transparent. And if we don't do that, they won't buy our products.
Does anyone else on the panel want to say anything about the explicit nature in which we should be communicating the shrinkflation?
I think we do. As Marc said, the communication of the pence per 100 gram, when we've talked to consumers, they do look at that. So they do take notice of the pence per 100 gram of the pack. So if that changes, then consumers notice. Should that be in bigger writing? I think that's a supermarket point. But when we talk to consumers, our Dorset consumers that we've communicated with do understand. They do know what's happened. You know, and they'll be very quick to tell us if that's a problem to them.
Anyone else want to comment? Because a lot of people are very explicit when they increase the size of something like 20% extra free. That has, changes the design of a box of cereal when there's 20% extra free. But when there's 20% taken out, that's not really explicit on the box, is it?
I think I'd reinforce the point that I've seen from 2 of my peers here today. One, consumers are savvy, right? If you look at what happens as price changes, prices are elastic and there is choice for consumers. So Although I obviously don't represent the retailers and can't comment on their specific businesses, they all have very large private label businesses. So both from a fairness and a supply chain perspective, that the retailers have some visibility of what it costs to produce similar products, but also in terms of giving consumers choice at different price points, both through our own various sizes of, say, some of the competitor products I might have with Marc in mayonnaise, or through products that the retailer has a direct competitor like baked beans. There are a range of choices for consumers. And I do also agree that if you look at the shelf price, it is reasonably transparent on shelf. Again, it's a retailer concern, but that shows both the absolute price and the pence per gram or pence per litre, depending on what type of product you're looking at.
I'm going to hand back to the chair.
Thank you. Derek, did you want to make another point?
I could comment on a really similar subject, but to do with labelling. So one thing that really concerns retailers, very small shops that are placed in local communities where they can really meet some of the needs that are being addressed, is the recommended retail price, which sometimes is a loss leader for them, because they can't, if it's exactly the same price in a supermarket, they just can't run their business and deliver the same product for that price. So as a result, those items aren't made available to local consumers. Now, I appreciate that it's a more complex thing and I'm making it sound, but on the other side, it's a real example of where freight costs push up the price. So consumers there don't have access to choice because of these recommended retail price. What is the reason for putting recommended retailer prices across the whole of the sector, so that if you buy that item, whether you're buying it at a supermarket or in a tiny corner shop that's serving a really isolated community, there's no movement on the price? Does that make sense?
I think the first thing I'd say is that retail pricing is at the sole discretion of the retailer. So what a retailer chooses to sell at, we can't influence, and legally we can't influence that. So I can't comment on the fact that retailers choose to sell at different prices.
Yeah, but if you're putting on a label $3.90, say $1.99, recommended retail price $1.99, going back to transparency for the consumer, that's what they expect to pay.
Sorry, can I ask for clarity what you mean by on the label?
So on a label, you might have recommended retail price $1.99. You're right. The retail,
on a shelf edge label or on
the item itself?
On the item. Oh, like a.
So you're talking about labelling. So you're right. The retailer who has had the extra cost of running a tiny outlet in a really important remote community might have the right to put the price up, but actually, in terms of transparency and justice for the consumer, that retailer really is under pressure to sell it for the recommended retail price. So actually, that is a decision.
I think what's worth saying in that instance is you'd never have a situation where you only had what we call price mark pack. There would always be a non-price mark pack available as well in our portfolio. So it's entirely up to that retailer if they choose to buy the price mark pack that is typically linked to a promotional offer for them as well. Okay, but again, there would always be a choice between the two there. So I think characterising it as no choice for the retailer, I would say is not accurate, because typically, and I think always, there would be a choice of a non-price marked and a price mark pack. And again, I'd come back to the point then, in that instance, the price on the shelf is at the sole discretion of the retailer. It's not something that we're allowed to influence.
That really is a question for wholesalers who actually in an area like mine, West Cornwall, actually there is only one or two wholesalers and they all carry the recommended retail price. Good. So I appreciate what you're saying. And I appreciate that you're giving choice, but it might just not get to anywhere near the consumer. I don't know, would that be relevant to you as well, Marc?
It's a relatively small part of our business that would go through that wholesale, to be perfectly honest. But I would agree with Dominic that there would always be two different areas, and price mark pack is not typically used. It usually is associated to a discounted product, and the idea behind price mark pack is that for those small retailers that they aren't taking advantage of the discounted price and not passing it on to their consumers. But just as Dominic said, we would always have two offerings, if you like, non-price marked or price marked pack.
Come on holiday in Cornwall and have a good look at some of our little stores, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. But sorry about that.
Thank you, Derek. No, I mean, just going back to baked beans, if we may. Dominic, you said it was sort of price sensitive whether the source or the beans were more expensive. I've been sent shopping and bought the cheapest beans I could find, and I've got to say that it's all source and not many beans. So I'd hazard a guess that beans are actually more expensive than the source, and therefore by taking 10 beans out of a can, you're probably making that can slightly cheaper to put on the shelf. Would you agree?
I'd reinforce the point that we haven't deliberately reformulated to reduce the number of beans in the can. So the reformulation that I think was referred to was very deliberately done to improve quality perceptions for our consumers. It was not linked to any pricing initiative.
Okay.
Look, one of the things that I would say about the products that we sell is we deliberately formulate them for the things that our consumers love. If we make the product worse, and you talk about your experience of another baked bean that was, I think, all sauce and no bean, as you characterised it,
one.
People probably won't buy it again. So if we're going to ensure that people continue to love the products that we sell and continue to love Heinz baked beans, we need to maintain quality on them, or simply people will choose a different product if they don't believe that the value we ask for the product meets the quality standards that they expect and the taste they expect from the product.
Okay. I'm afraid I put curry powder in my beans, which probably spoils all your fancy formulations.
We do have an excellent curry beans that will do it for you if you'd like.
Wonderful. That presumably where the term bean counters comes from, with the people that look into how many there are in a bit kind of bean. Neil, let's move on.
Thank you. The products are available. I just wanted to explore further some of the relationship between processors, manufacturers and retailers. Broadly, how have the high rates of food price inflation affected your relationship with retailers? Do you want to start with that, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah. So we are, as the panel before us said, we buy mainly grains from farmers, and so we're a price taker because it's an internationally traded commodity. And in fact, the AIC, who were here earlier, there's contracts that we trade on. So we tend to be price takers of our raw materials. So when we get raw material price input, we then see if we can find a way to manage that in our supply chain, and if we can't, then we pass that on to the retailer. And the retailers buy in different groups. So there tends to be a buying group for each food sector. And so the one's relationship differs depending on the market dynamics in that particular sector. So if there's more supply than there is demand, then it's much harder to get a price increase because the retailers have got lots of places to go. The retailers tend to have either a partnership relationship with one supplier in a category, and then the others tend to be more transactional, and that varies across different retailers. Changing from partnership to transaction is a painful process, but it does happen, and that also changes the longevity of the conversation that you have. I would like to say that I think that the Grocery Trade Adjudicator has done a really great job over the last 10 years that he's existed in improving the trading relationships between suppliers and retailers. I think retailers have got much better about their responsibilities, about holding to contracts. They do write more contracts, and I fully appreciate if you don't have legal support in an organisation, if you're a small business, you can sign contracts that you don't quite realise what you're signing up to, and I can see that being an issue. But I think the Grocery Trade Adjudicator has made a much leveller playing field of what we're dealing with.
Okay. I'm going to come to specific examples for Marc and Dominic, but Baz, did you want to sort of comment on how healthy is your relationship with the retailers and what's going on?
I think especially if you go back to early 22, where we had exceptional cost increases around the globe on all kinds of products there, which I think was a new dynamic that nobody was actually kind of figuring out in the early days. Kind of, is this going to continue or not, or is this just a month or not? So of course, in that period, there is a natural tension in the supply chain. For the reason, as I just said, everybody continues to strive for the preference of the consumer, so nobody wants to pass on price increases, but it's needed. But I have to say is that we have found a very constructive and sustainable way to deal with our pricings with retail in it. But of course, when it suddenly goes up, there is always a tension of when to increase prices that sits there. I think that's a natural part of the value chain that we sit in.
Okay, thank you. Come to you, Dominic, in terms of the sort of cycle of inflationary prices and if they're coming down, how that then is passed on to the customer via the retailer. You used the phrase, we invest in our pricing.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate what exactly you mean? How does that process work? Because you've also said that you can't influence pricing. So how do you invest in pricing in your products then? How does that work?
Yeah, very, very happy to explain. Just I guess to clarify for a moment, we didn't say pricing as a whole was coming down. We are still seeing inflation in our key commodities, but let me explain. So I was giving specific examples of promotional pricing. So there's a number of different ways we can help influence it. Clearly, we agree a promotional plan with retailers, and we help fund those promotional discounts that you'd see in retailers. Mm-hmm. So as we've seen less inflation than maybe we'd seen in, say, 2020 to 22, as we've seen through 2023, that start to ease somewhat. Yeah. We've been able to reinvest in lower promotional prices that we help support the retailers to do. So if you were to look at things like our 4-pack or 6-pack beans that are bought with very high frequency by consumers, and the same would go for our large format tomato ketchup, you'll see lower promotional discount prices than you did through 2023. So it helps pass on a lower price to consumers. So though it still remains at the sole discretion of the retailer exactly what they choose to sell it for, we obviously have recommended discounts, and we help fund those discounts to the retailers to pass them on to the consumer.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to keep going on the bean side of things. I'm going to push a slightly different angle on Beangate now. In June 2022, Kraft Heinz stopped supplying some key products to Tesco's. I'm talking about Heinz beans, tomato ketchup, and I think soup as well. And this was following a dispute about absorbing increases in raw material, energy, and fuel costs. Do you want to give us the background to that dispute, and what does that dispute reveal about the power of the processors over the retailers? What happened with Beangate?
So I think without going into anything that's commercially sensitive, what I do think it exhibits well is that the retailers do have significant power to help maintain fairness in the supply chain. So we've talked about it being a really competitive market, and that applies both to retailers and also to consumers who have choice across different products that, say, would compete with beans. So it's actually probably quite a good example of where certain retailers were able to push back on price that we may want to put through from a cost price perspective to the retailer. And they've got various tools at their disposal if they don't want to accept pricing that we put through. So it could be that we get into dispute and we're unable to agree pricing. It could be that they choose to delist products or not list new product developments that we've got. So for me and for us, I think it would demonstrate that there is inevitably a commercial tension in the supply chain when there's a time of strong inflation. We've heard Baz from Arla talk about similar sorts of challenges, and I think in that period where we were seeing unprecedented and very extreme inflation, that led to difficult commercial discussions with all our retail partners. Everybody wants to try and maintain low prices for consumers. The retailers obviously want to make sure that they remain competitive as well. So I think it is one of the things that shows how fairness can work in the supply chain. They've got a lot of tools at their disposal to push back. We don't have the ability to put through price if the retailer won't accept it, and it shows how they're able to push back with one of the tools in their toolbox.
But with respect, you said these were difficult commercial discussions that you had. You wanted the price increases to be passed on, and Tesco's played a bit of hardball with you, saying that they would not pass on unjustifiable price increases to their customers. But then you played hardball in that by saying, OK, we're going to stop supplying you. So then that led to shortages for a short period. And then in July 2022, both companies then issued a joint statement saying that they had reached an agreement. So you said that these were difficult commercial discussions, but there was hardball, and you said, right, we're stopping you, led to shortages, and then there was an agreement. That sounds a bit stronger than difficult commercial discussions, doesn't it?
I think at any time when you're trying to negotiate some pretty extreme changes in input cost inflation, you inevitably end up in very difficult commercial discussions. I think you've referenced the joint statement we made with Tesco at the time that reflects the joint position we came to, but there's no hiding away from the fact it was very public and a very difficult negotiation with them as we tried to come to an agreement on what was appropriate. I think we've said and been very public about the fact that we came to an agreement on that, but again, it was very clear that it was a very difficult discussion with them for a period of time.
Would you do that again? Would you play hardball again and say, well, if you're not going to do what we want you to do, we ain't going to supply you?
I think we'd have to review it on a case-by-case basis at the moment. We have no plans to put through cost price as things stand, so it's not something we're contemplating at the moment, to be clear, but we'd have to review things on a case-by-case basis. It was a very extreme example, to be clear. It's not something that we'd do lightly. and it was a very difficult negotiation, as I think was very public at the time.
Okay, thank you. Over to you now, Marc. In terms of Unilever, in September 2023, it was reported that Unilever wanted Wilko to pay outstanding debts up front before it supplied products to the chain. So again, difficult commercial discussions or playing hardball, we're not going to supply you until you pay up front. What would your take be on that?
Again, without wanting to go into the absolutes, because these are confidential discussions. With the case of Wilkinson, it was a great tragedy, to be perfectly honest, to see that important part of the UK high street disappear. We actually worked really closely with Wilko during that period of time to make sure we could supply products to them. I'm not going to go into the details as to how that occurs, but when a company goes into administration, you do need to have some security over their ability to pay for the products that they want from you. Plus, all our retailers have a certain degree of credit, and therefore they will have quite a lot of stock in their supply chains that they haven't necessarily paid for. Now, that's something that you have to work through with administrators, and that's what we did at the time. And I'm proud to say that we did actually, which wasn't reported at the time because it couldn't be, we were able to find ways to supply Wilko right until the end. So
I take your point that it's a situation where the company's under threat and you're trying to sort of work things through. But I guess what I'm trying to get at with my line of questioning is, what does that example is a more extreme example, but the other examples we've talked about, I guess to all four of you, what does this tell us about suppliers and their strength or bargaining power over retailers, and what can we as a committee do to recommend that is a balanced arrangement that ultimately supports customers in the front line to get affordable, good quality, nutritious food at affordable prices, and also supporting our farmers and food producers who are actually supplying that. How can we get a balance within that sector so that there's fairness within the system?
I mean, I think the examples that you show do point to a fairness in the system, and as Dominic also says, there is a balance. In the end, manufacturers of food and food retailers are both really focused on getting great offers to shoppers, and that is, very much the focus of both organisations. So there is common ground in that space. I would echo the comments from Sarah about G-Scott being there to make sure and to adjudicate, just to make sure that everything is always in that space. But my experience is that actually there's a great deal of collaboration to make sure that the right result happens for UK consumers. Of course, there is tension in that system, and that's quite right. And that will mean occasionally, in extreme examples which have been discussed, that products may not be delivered in the way that we would like, but that's never the focus.
Can all of you give assurances that you are thinking of the consumer to do the right thing by them, but also thinking of the farmer and the grower as well, to make sure that there's fairness for them? Because we've seen them struggling, and as my colleague has said, we've seen consumers struggling. Can you give assurances to this committee that you're looking out for all sides of the equation?
We are a farmer-owned company, right? So, I mean, that's where it starts. For us, is that we honestly represent the farmer out there, and that's where it all starts in the food chain. So, absolutely.
And we're constantly looking for ways to pay our farmers more than just the market. So with Jordan Cereals, for example, we've got the Jordan's Farm Partnership that pays a premium over the market for farmers to do environmental work on their farms. And we've got the same with some wheat farmers for allied mills who are farming in a more environmental way. We pay them a premium over the market. So we work hard to do that on both sides.
Yeah, look, we'd say the same. Clearly on the consumer side, we're really focused on delivering value for our consumers, and they have choice if we don't. So it's really critical both for our own interests and for the interests of the consumers that we do that. It's worth saying we probably have a much smaller agricultural footprint in the UK than, say, Arla or ABF, but we do interact with a lot of farmers all over the world. I talked about tomatoes earlier, I talked about beans. It's incumbent on us to have transparency and fairness with our farmers so that they can succeed, particularly in an area like tomatoes where we have such a big footprint and we buy all over the world. It's absolutely critical that we work with farmers to ensure supply now, but also in the future when we look at things like climate change that are going to have a big impact on tomatoes in the future. So it's both in our interests, but it's also the right thing to do and something that we're very committed to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think my sort of key takeaway from this section is that, if I went to Tesco's with a shopping list for my wife to buy Heinz ketchup, and there wasn't any, it would be a matter of some discussion. And, Cravendale, we always buy Cravendale milk because it lasts forever.
Very much.
And, other products, but you invest in the quality of your product, you invest in advertising so people, know this. But what about those other suppliers where they can't have this standoff with Tesco? Because Tesco said, well, forget it, we won't just stock your product. I mean, how do you feel their negotiations with the big supermarkets go, and do you think they ever win?
The first thing I'd say is I can't comment specifically on other suppliers. I would reference what some of my peers have said here, though, that I think the grocery code adjudicator has had quite a big impact on that over the last decade. It's been there to help address some of those concerns, but not as a representative of one of those smaller suppliers. I probably can't comment with a great deal of knowledge, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I can see the situation that the supermarket comes to me, the supplier said, good news, we're going to promote your product. Bad news is you're going to pay for the promotion. And pretty much you're in a difficult position to sort of negotiate with the supermarkets, which is where I think, this committee hopefully will have some conclusions and maybe bring those forward. Ian's been waiting very patiently to ask the last question.
Thanks, Jay. Just on affordable and healthy food, and I just want to put into context the seriousness of where we find ourselves now. So Matt Aston, the Director of Public Health for Liverpool, wrote this week, without action, food preferences will be shaped at such a young age that they will cause ongoing ill health, and therefore demand on health and social care for generations to come, widening the already unacceptable 20-year gap in healthy life expectancy between the richest and the poorest members of society. To bring about real change, we need to create an environment that promotes good health and healthy eating. Achieving this will require bold thinking from national and local governments, collaborative working across all sectors, including the food and drinks industry. So I'll start with you first, Sarah. What steps are your company taking, and any examples to promote affordable and healthy eating?
So, safe, affordable, nutritious food is what we're all about. That's what we're trying to do. Yeah. We're constantly striving to improve both the quality of the products that we have and to launch new products that actually consumers want to buy, that taste great, but also are more healthy. Kingsmill 50/50 bread is a great example of that. That's been around for many years now, and it's a way of getting fibre into kids who won't eat brown bread. And that's the leading bread in its sector, and it's also really affordable. We've got a no added sugar granola, which is relatively newly launched, again, which we're trying to get a great tasting product to give consumers a really healthy breakfast, because granola is really healthy. And then we've reduced fat and salt content in our cooking sauces. But the products that we make generally are staples for people to consume at home. So we work really hard to try and make those healthy. I think, generally speaking, a curry made at home from a patak sauce will be healthier than a takeaway.
Have you got any foods within your range that would be classed as HFSS?
We've got 6% of our entire portfolio that's within categories that are measured is HFSS. Yeah, which is sort of things like Kingsmill pancakes. Okay. And some of the mueslis which have got a high nut content because nuts.
You're looking at reducing that percentage.
We'll try and bring that down the best we can. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks, Baz.
Yeah, this is what dairy is all about. Health. I mean, milk and yogurt is almost sold in every store in the UK. I think also dare to say that it is still at an affordable price. Just to buy, and milk is one of the most nutritious products, nutritiously dense products there is, and it's available in almost every store in the UK. And we believe at an affordable, responsible price. So it's what we're all about.
So from your company and HFSS. Is there any products that you've actually got within that? Because I know yogurt can fall really foul of that.
No. I need to. I actually don't know top of mind, but we sell products with high sugar. We have those which could be a milk-based beverage, for example.
Is it possible for you to find that out and inform the committee?
Of course, that is no problem at all. But just as a comment in general on that, I think at the end it's all about having a balanced diet. Sometimes people also enjoy a product that might not be that healthy. You should not drink 3 a day.
You do, but also you talk about cheap food, and obviously if you're on as Kat mentioned, the budget, which at the moment is extremely stretched, well, unfortunately you might only be able to afford food which is classed as HFSS, which then has a knock-on impact on what we're talking about from a life expectancy point of view. So it's a hugely important subject that we ensure that the nation's health's looked after.
I agree.
And if you're not economically well off, then you've got the opportunity with good, nutritious food.
Yeah, and then I hope they will continue to buy milk. It helps.
Yeah.
Dominic, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll come back with the exact figure. I'm pretty sure it's 95% non-HFSS. So, again, what I'd reinforce is the same things that Sarah has said. So for almost all of...
Just on that, Dominic, according to the Oxford research, 33% of Kraft Heinz sales comes from HFSS.
I think we'd have to check if that's the global or local. We checked our figures beforehand, and we've got, according to the government guidance on things considered non-HFSS for a retail perspective, we had 95% non-HFSS, but we can come back and write
you've got 5%.
That's the figures that I was provided beforehand.
Can you make sure that you inform the committee, because someone's selling porkies?
No problem at all. We can come back in writing on that. Again, I'd reinforce what Sarah has said. We do offer also low-fat, salt and sugar versions of many of our products. So you'll see it on beans, you'll see it on ketchup, you'll see lower-fat versions of our mayonnaise and salad cream. So again, what we'd also do is reformulate our products over a period of time, but make sure at the same time that we're offering new products that offer choice to consumers. So you'll see that in other diet choices. For example, we've offered plant-based versions of cream of tomato soup, for example, and similarly done the same on our Heinz beans and sausage. So where there's other dietary requirements as well, we're aiming to fulfil that part of the market too.
Can you tell me if Kraft opposed NDWB's National Food Strategy recommendations for a salt and sugar reformulation tax? Have you got that knowledge?
I don't have that specific knowledge. I have read the National Food Strategy, but I'd have to go back and check our position
Is it
on
possible
that.
So we can get that position clear on where Kraft
we can
actually
come back
stood
to
on that? And coming to you, Marc, research by the University of Oxford has found that 84% of Unilever's sales come from packaged food and drink classified as being high in fat, salt and sugar. Do you worry about that figure? And it keeps me awake at night, to be honest, because obviously we're talking about the health of a nation. We're talking about a lot of them figures will be diametrically pointed at people who are struggling economically, and we know that through. You touched on the food banks before. Many of our products will be in the food banks, yeah. And again, people haven't got choice, but they're eating potentially something which is extremely unhealthy for them.
We are constantly looking at ways to make our food products more healthy. We don't offer core foods, and most of our foods are supplements like mayonnaise or Marmite, for example. So one of the things, your numbers, I think we are now are about 65% HFSS, and so 35% non-HFSS. Products like Marmite, we reformulated. We offer a low-salt version. Of course, it's used in very small quantities. Pot noodle, we have changed completely the way in which we produce that product using sunflower oil now, which is 70% less saturated fat than previous pot noodles. And obviously we have a big ice cream business. We're working extremely hard to make sure that we get that as healthy as possible, but it is a treat. The most important part of that portfolio is our kids' portfolio, and our entire children's portfolio is now non-HFSS. So less than 110 calories per serving and complies to all HFSS. So we are always looking for ways to improve our products, but we are also operating in treat categories. So it's a bit of both.
Yeah,
really.
I understand that element of it, but it feels as though sometimes the food industry is poisoning the nation. When we read some of the things that's coming out about HFSS, it's terrifying. The impact it has on the National Health Service, the impact it has on nation's health. It's the moral responsibility to go far quicker than what you're going with regards 65%. And genuinely, you have got a moral responsibility. I mean, your company, especially if you look at Port Sunlight, social responsibility elements of it, is that being lost now in the chase for profit?
Not at all. It's fundamental to what we do, so we really do take that responsibility seriously. There's a lot we can do, not just with our formulations, but also working on campaigns and marketing. We've done a lot of work on, for example, how you can use Hellmann's mayonnaise to reuse food that you may not have used and reduce food waste. So there are lots of ways that you can make people eat healthier, encourage people to cook and have cooking skills. We have a big program with Knorr, which is our stocks, to encourage people to cook at home. And all those things improve the nation's health, and we take it extremely seriously. So we share your concerns. We're working extremely hard to make sure we both improve the products, but that we also play our role in making sure that UK consumers have better ways to eat food and know how to cook again.
So I'll go back to Sarah. Bite Back has called on the government to mandate businesses to report publicly and consistently on sales of unhealthy food and drinks and sustainability metrics on a yearly basis. Would you support the introduction of such a measure?
We absolutely support the reporting. The assurance, i.e. the auditing, can be a real enormous cost with no particular added value. So, like food waste, we've been reporting food waste to RAP for the last 10 years, I think, since 2015 when RAP introduced their... so we're absolutely happy to report, but the constant increase in assurance, so the constant bills that auditors charge us to assure things that actually are really hard to assure by, an auditor, is a cost we don't really support. But we absolutely support the concept and the emotion behind it, absolutely.
I don't really have anything to add to what Sarah said there. I think she's put it really well. There is quite an administrative burden if it's not well thought through, but the principle I think we'd support.
Yeah, the principle would drive down the HFSS, wouldn't it, surely, if it is a light shone on it. So it's hugely important, Baz?
Yeah, fully support.
Excellent. Marc?
Same position.
Also, Marc, I should have asked you before as well. Did your company actually oppose Dimbleby's National Food Strategy recommendations for the salt and sugar reformulation tax?
I would have to check that.
So could you let me know? I think it's important for the context of the committee. All right, thanks,
Thank you. Dr. Hudson has a brief question.
Just a quick sort of supplementary, following up from my colleague Derek. You guys, I guess, you're the big guys in what you do, and you are dealing with the big guys in the front line that, as you rightly say, we'll be talking to in a few weeks, the big supermarkets. But following up my colleague's question, when you've got a small little convenience store, a community store in a rural village, or you've got a little sort of corner store in a city or a town who can't compete with the big guys, but the customers going in there with their busy lives and their farmers, or their workers in the local hospital or whatever, what can you guys do to help those small retailers be able to sell some of your product at a reasonable price? I mean, because your big trade negotiations are with the big guys, but what can you do to help get your product out into the more dispersed areas, whether it's in cities, on street corners, or in rural villages, so that we can get sort of equality of access for the products that you guys have been, banging the drum for today? But how can we, have a level playing field in that sense?
I think that there's an enormous role here for the food wholesalers, as Derek said. So we supply a number of the big wholesalers who then service the smaller stores, and making sure that those wholesalers get a competitive price that they can then pass on to their customers is absolutely key. I mean, one of the biggest is owned by Tesco. So, Booker's, which is a big supplier into that sector, is a Tesco-owned. So they actually get all of the benefits of the big guy negotiations. But we do work hard to make sure that the wholesalers that can get into those convenience areas actually do get a really good deal that's commensurate with the retailers, so that they can pass those prices on. And we deliver bread ourselves to many of those stores.
Right.
Yeah, and that's I think that's exactly the role of the wholesaler, is they consolidate in behalf of the smaller stores, you could argue. So therefore they have a certain balance of purchasing, but also a certain balance of logistical efficiency, where we can consolidate the supply chain there together. And we do the same. So we work closely with those wholesalers together, making sure that our products are also distributed in those stores.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Quick supplement.
Yeah, sorry to just sort of burst in the middle of this discussion about healthy food, but to what extent do you guys control, I'm sorry if it's already been covered, the prices charged for, I'm looking at Ben & Jerry's, just on Deliveroo, we're talking about sort of corner stores and stuff, and the discrepancy is Morrison's are selling it for £5.49 for a 465ml tub, and there's somewhere here selling it for £9.95. The average price seems to be about £7.50, £8. I mean, do you have any say in that or any influence in that whatsoever?
No, so we do not have an influence over retail pricing, and that's important. It's part of the legal way in which we do business. So nobody on this panel will have an influence over retail pricing, and so I can't comment on any of those prices.
Okay, just interested. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming to give evidence. I've worked out this week, I've had something made by each of your companies, and I feel very well and very fit and healthy. So it's all about quantities and balance, I think, I suspect. So thanks very much for coming. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.